stood frozen behind the velvet curtain, my palms slick with sweat, watching Dr. Colin Pierce step into the spotlight like he owned it. Camera flashes exploded across the auditorium. 200 people, investors, journalists, board members, rose to their feet in applause. On the massive screen behind him, my research slides glowed under stage lights. My data, my formulas. My 2 years of sleepless nights condensed into a presentation that had my work written all over it, except for one crucial detail. My name wasn't anywhere on those slides. Instead, in bold letters across the title page, it read, Breakthrough Gene Therapy Protocol Lead Innovator, Dr. Colin Pierce. My stomach twisted into knots so tight I thought I might be sick right there backstage. Colin smiled that practiced, charismatic smile he'd perfected over years of climbing corporate ladders on other people's backs. He gestured broadly at the screen, his voice booming through the speakers. This discovery represents the culmination of my life's work, he said, pausing for effect. A breakthrough that will revolutionize how we approach genetic disorders. The audience erupted again. My fists clenched at my sides, nails digging into my palms hard enough to leave marks. He didn't even glance toward the wings where I stood. Didn't acknowledge the woman who'd actually spent countless hours in the lab while he'd been at golf courses and board dinners. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to keep the polite smile frozen on my face even though no one could see me yet. You'll thank me later, I whispered to the darkness, for letting you dig your own grave. My name is Morgan Hayes, and I'm 31 years old. I should probably start by explaining how I ended up backstage at my own stolen victory, but that requires going back 3 months to when I still believed hard work and talent mattered more than politics and manipulation. I'd worked at Helix Biogenetics for 4 years, starting as a junior research analyst fresh out of my doctorate program. The company specialized in cutting-edge genetic research, and landing a position there had felt like winning the lottery. For the first 3 years, I'd kept my head down, worked impossible hours, and slowly built a reputation as someone reliable, thorough, and innovative. My supervisor had been Dr. Vega, a brilliant woman in her 60s who'd mentored me through dozens of projects. But Dr. Vega had retired 8 months ago, and that's when everything changed. Her replacement was Dr. Colin Pierce, 42 years old, handsome in that polished executive way, charismatic enough to charm investors and ruthless enough to crush anyone who stood between him and advancement. He had a PhD from an impressive university and exactly 0 breakthrough discoveries to his name, but he was a master at taking credit for other people's work. I'd heard the whispers about his previous positions, about researchers who'd left suddenly or been pushed to different departments after their projects became successful under his leadership. But I'd thought, naively, stupidly, that if I just focused on the science, none of that would matter. I thought my work would speak for itself. That was my first mistake. It started 3 months before the press conference, on a Tuesday morning that seemed completely ordinary. I'd been working on a gene therapy protocol for 18 months, a project I'd proposed myself, researched independently, and developed through countless failed experiments and late nights. The breakthrough had come 2 weeks earlier, at 3 in the morning when most of the building was empty. I'd isolated a specific gene sequence that, when modified using a new delivery method I'd designed, showed remarkable success in correcting genetic mutations in lab trials. My hands had shaken as I'd run the tests again and again, unable to believe it was actually working. I'd documented everything meticulously, video recordings of the experiments, detailed notes, time-stamped computer files showing my methodology. That Tuesday morning, I'd arrived at work early to finish polishing my presentation for the weekly department meeting. I'd planned to share my preliminary results with the team, get feedback, and propose next steps for human trial applications. My slides were saved on both my desktop and the shared department server, carefully organized and ready to present. Around 10 o'clock, Colin had appeared at my workstation. He'd leaned against my desk with that casual confidence he always projected, looking over my shoulder at the presentation open on my screen. "Impressive work, Morgan," he'd said, his tone warm and encouraging. "This could be really significant." My heart had swelled with pride. Finally, recognition from my supervisor. "Thank you. I'm excited to share it at the meeting this afternoon." Colin had nodded thoughtfully. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Just want to make sure we're presenting it in the strongest possible way to the team. I'd hesitated for only a second before nodding. Of course, it's in the shared folder under my name, Hayes Gene Therapy Protocol. Colin had smiled and patted my shoulder. Great work, Morgan. Really, I'll take it from here. Just need to review it and maybe add some context about how it fits into our broader departmental goals. At the time, I thought he was being supportive, helping me position my discovery in a way that would get department buy-in and funding approval. I'd watched him copy my presentation file to his personal drive, thinking it was just standard supervisory review. I'll see you at the meeting, I'd said, already imagining the reactions from my colleagues when they saw what I'd accomplished. Colin had given me that charming smile again. Actually, why don't you take the afternoon off? You've been working crazy hours on this. I'll handle the initial presentation to the team, and we can discuss next steps tomorrow. I should have questioned it, should have insisted on presenting my own work. But I'd been exhausted from months of intense research, and the idea of an afternoon off had sounded appealing. Plus, I'd trusted him. I'd actually trusted him. Are you sure? I'd asked. Absolutely, you deserve a break. Go get some rest. So I'd left early that Tuesday, gone home, and collapsed on my couch with relief. I'd slept for 4 hours straight, dreaming about what this breakthrough might mean for my career. When I'd woken up, I'd checked my email out of habit. There had been nothing about the department meeting. No follow-up. No mention of my protocol. I'd logged into the shared server to look at my files, thinking maybe Colin had left notes or suggestions. That's when my stomach had dropped. My original presentation file, the one I'd saved under my name, was gone, deleted from the server entirely. I'd sat staring at my laptop screen, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Colin had moved it to a different folder for organization. Maybe there'd been a server glitch. I'd checked my desktop backup, still there, thank God, but the shared version had vanished completely. The next morning, Wednesday, I'd arrived at work early and gone straight to Colin's office. He'd been at his desk, looking relaxed and confident, sipping expensive coffee from a ceramic mug. "Morgan," he'd greeted me warmly. "Feeling rested? What happened to my presentation?" I'd asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The file from the shared server, it's gone." Colin had frowned slightly, the picture of concern. "Oh, I reorganized some files yesterday. Don't worry, everything's backed up. I incorporated your preliminary findings into a broader departmental presentation. The team was really impressed." Something cold had settled in my chest. "Incorporated? What do you mean?" "Well, your protocol is excellent work, but it needed context. I presented it as part of our overall gene therapy initiatives, showed how it connects to the department's strategic goals." He'd leaned back in his chair. "The board is very excited. They want a full presentation next month." I should have been excited, should have felt proud, but something about the way he'd said incorporated and our initiatives had made my skin crawl. "Can I see the presentation you gave?" Colin had hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Sure, of course. I'll send it over later today. Right now, I need you to start preparing documentation for the patent application. This could be huge for the company." The presentation he'd eventually sent me that afternoon had made me physically ill. My entire protocol, every detail, every methodology, every result, had been reformatted under a new title, Pierce Departmental Gene Therapy Initiative. My name appeared exactly once, in small text at the bottom of slide 17. Laboratory work assisted by M. Hayes and team. Assisted. Like I'd been a lab technician following his instructions instead of the person who'd conceived, designed, and executed the entire project. I'd read through those slides 3 times, each pass making me angrier and more helpless. He'd reworded my explanations just enough to make them sound like his voice. He'd rearranged my data to fit his narrative. He'd turned my breakthrough into his achievement. That evening, I'd paced my apartment for hours, trying to decide what to do. Confront him directly. Go to HR, tell the team what really happened. Every option seemed to lead to the same outcome. My word against his, a junior researcher against a department director with connections throughout the company. By midnight, I'd made a decision. I wouldn't scream or make accusations I couldn't prove. Instead, I'd do what I did best, research, document, and build an airtight case. I'd spent that entire night going through my backup files, my lab notebooks. Every piece of evidence that proved the protocol was mine. I'd organized everything chronologically, making copies of computer files with visible timestamps, printing emails where I discussed my methodology with colleagues, gathering video footage from the lab's security cameras that showed me working alone on the experiments. If Colin wanted to steal my discovery, he'd have to do it in broad daylight with the whole world watching. The next few weeks had been surreal. Colin had started calling department meetings where he'd present updates on his gene therapy protocol using my research. Each meeting, I'd sat in the back of the conference room, watching him explain concepts I'd developed, answer questions about methodology I'd perfected, accept praise for innovations I'd created. My colleague Alina, who worked in the lab next to mine, had cornered me after one particularly galling presentation. "That's your work," she'd whispered urgently. "Everyone who pays attention knows it's your work. Why aren't you saying anything?" I'd glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Because I don't have proof he'll accept, not yet." Alina had looked confused. "What do you mean you have your original files, your lab notes?" "I have my versions," I'd interrupted quietly. "He has the company's official version. He's the director. Who do you think they'll believe?" She'd squeezed my arm sympathetically. "This isn't right, Morgan." "I know," I'd said, forcing a calm smile. "But sometimes fighting isn't about who's loudest. It's about who's most prepared." Alina had nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "If you need anything, any backup, any documentation, I'm here." That conversation had given me my first ally. Over the next week, Alina had quietly helped me access lab security footage showing the dates and times I'd worked on the protocol, always alone, often in the middle of the night when Colin was nowhere near the building. We'd been careful, downloading files to personal drives, making copies that couldn't be traced back to company servers. Meanwhile, Colin had started a campaign to marginalize me. It had been subtle at first, excluding me from certain meetings, reassigning some of my ongoing projects to other researchers, questioning my work in ways that made me seem incompetent or unreliable. During one department presentation, he'd interrupted me mid-sentence. "Morgan, I think you're getting a bit lost in the technical details. Why don't we table this discussion and come back to it when you've had time to organize your thoughts better?" The room had gone silent. My face had burned with humiliation. "I'm presenting data from—" "I understand." Colin had cut me off again, his tone patronizing. "But we need to stay focused on the big picture. Let's move on." After the meeting, several colleagues had approached me with sympathetic looks that somehow made it worse. "Don't let him get to you," one had whispered. But the damage was done. Colin was building a narrative about me, the scattered researcher who couldn't handle pressure, who needed constant supervision, who assisted on important projects but couldn't lead them. I'd realized his strategy wasn't just about taking credit for my discovery. He was actively destroying my credibility so that if I ever did speak up, no one would believe me. That week, rumors had started circulating. People whispered that I was having trouble adjusting after Dr. Vega's retirement, that I was overwhelmed by the pressure of working on significant projects, that I'd contributed some preliminary work to Colin's gene therapy breakthrough but had needed him to pull it all together. Each whisper had felt like a knife between my ribs, but I'd kept my head down and continued documenting everything. Every slight, every stolen idea, every manipulation. The truth was forming a pattern even Colin wouldn't be able to talk his way out of. 6 weeks after Colin had stolen my presentation, Dr. Vega had called me. She'd retired to spend time with her grandchildren but still kept in touch with former colleagues. "Morgan, I've been hearing concerning things," she'd said without preamble. "About you and about Colin." I'd been in the lab supply closet, taking a moment alone after another humiliating department meeting. Hearing her voice had broken something open inside me, and suddenly I'd been crying, really crying for the first time since this nightmare had started. "He took it," I'd sobbed. "My protocol, my research, everything. He took it and put his name on it and nobody believes me. They think I'm losing it, that I can't handle the pressure." Dr. Vega had been quiet for a moment. "Are you familiar with the concept of documented evidence?" "What?" "In science, we prove claims with evidence, reproducible, documented, time-stamped evidence." Her voice had been steady, grounding. "You're a researcher, Morgan. You know how to build a case, so build one. Don't fight arrogance with noise. Fight it with receipts that no one can dispute." I'd wiped my eyes, her words cutting through my despair. But what if they still don't listen? What if his reputation protects him? Then you make the evidence so overwhelming that reputation becomes irrelevant. she'd said firmly. And you wait for the right moment, not when you're emotional or defensive, but when you're standing on completely solid ground with nowhere for him to run. That conversation had changed everything. Dr. Vega was right. I'd been approaching this wrong, letting my hurt and anger cloud my strategy. I needed to think like a scientist, objective, methodical, patient, building a hypothesis and gathering data until the conclusion was undeniable. The documentation project had become my obsession. I'd spent every evening organizing evidence, building timelines, creating a comprehensive record of how my protocol had developed from initial concept to breakthrough. I'd compiled emails showing I discussed specific methodologies with colleagues months before Colin had even joined our department. I'd gathered lab requisition forms I'd personally signed for specialized equipment needed for my experiments. I'd printed security logs showing I'd accessed the laboratory during hours when Colin had been documented at off-site meetings or company events. One night, around 2 a.m, I'd found something even better: metadata from the company's own server system. Every file saved to company servers included hidden information about when it was created, who created it, and every modification made afterward. I'd accessed the original version of my presentation file, the one Colin had supposedly incorporated into his work. The metadata showed clearly: created by M. Hayes, original save date 3 months before Colin's presentation, modified by C. Pierce. His modifications had consisted of changing the title page, removing my name from prominent positions, and rewording sections to sound like his voice. The metadata didn't lie. It was digital fingerprints showing exactly what had happened. I'd saved all of it to 3 separate backup drives, stored in different locations. One at my apartment, one in my gym locker, one in a safety deposit box at my bank. If Colin wanted to destroy evidence, he'd have to find all 3 copies. I'd felt the first stirrings of real power then, not the power of being loud or making accusations, but the quiet power of knowing the truth and having proof that couldn't be denied. 2 months before the press conference, a junior lab intern named Kyle had accidentally forwarded me an email. It had been meant for Colin, but had gone to the wrong address. Kyle had mixed up our email addresses, which were similar. The subject line had read, "Pierce Protocol Draft Presentation for Board Review." I'd opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a presentation file labeled Final Draft Pierce Gene Therapy. The attachment had contained my entire protocol, reformatted again, with even more references to Pierce's innovative approach and Dr. Pierce's groundbreaking methodology. There had also been a memo from the company's marketing department discussing patent applications and publication strategy. Not a single mention of my name anywhere. My face had gone hot with rage. I'd sat frozen at my desk, staring at that email, wanting to march straight to Colin's office and scream until someone listened. Instead, I'd taken a deep breath, forwarded the entire message to my personal email account, deleted the forward notification from the company's server, and then deleted Kyle's original email to me as if I'd never received it. I'd sat back in my chair, forcing myself to think strategically. This email was evidence of active fraud. Colin wasn't just taking credit in department meetings anymore. He was preparing to claim my discovery officially, legally, permanently through patents and publications. He was escalating, which meant I needed to escalate my documentation too. That afternoon, I'd quietly visited the company's IT department with a request that seemed routine. "I'm working on a comprehensive research summary and need access to my complete file history for the past 2 years. Can you help me export that?" The IT technician had barely looked up. "Sure, fill out this form." Within a week, I'd had a complete digital trail of every file I'd created, modified, or accessed over my entire time working on the gene therapy protocol. The IT export had been incredibly detailed, showing not just what I'd worked on but exact timestamps, file versions, and even the text content of certain documents at different stages of development. It had been like having a video recording of my research process, moment by moment. I'd compared it against Colin's timeline and found something damning. Several of his key insights and innovative approaches had appeared in his presentations within days of me documenting them in my private lab notes stored on the company server that he, as director, had access to. He'd been watching my work in real time, cherry-picking my best ideas, and presenting them as his own before I'd even had a chance to discuss them with the team. It had been systematic theft, documented in the company's own computer systems. But I'd still needed more. I'd needed something undeniable, something visceral that would make people understand emotionally, not just logically, what had happened. That's when I'd remembered the lab security cameras. Helix Biogenetics had installed comprehensive security systems 2 years ago after an incident with a disgruntled former employee. Every laboratory space had cameras recording 24 hours a day, with footage stored on secure servers for 6 months before being archived. Those cameras had watched me develop the entire protocol. I'd used a legitimate request, asking for security footage for personal research documentation purposes, to obtain copies of key dates. The footage had been perfect. Clear images of me working alone in the laboratory at night, running the experiments, recording the results, having my breakthrough moment at 3 in the morning when the protocol had finally worked. Colin had never appeared in any of that footage. Not once. 10 days ago, 2 weeks before the scheduled press conference, something unexpected had happened. I'd been contacted by a woman named Nora Delacroix, a venture capital investor who specialized in biotech startups. She'd requested a meeting at a coffee shop downtown, away from company property. I'd almost declined, confused about why an investor would want to meet with a junior researcher. But curiosity had won out. Nora had been in her mid-50s, sharply dressed, with the kind of direct gaze that made me feel like she could see through any pretense. We'd sat in a quiet corner booth, and she'd gotten straight to the point. "I've been researching Helix Biogenetics because we're considering a major investment," she'd said. "During my due diligence, I came across some interesting inconsistencies regarding Dr. Pierce's supposed gene therapy breakthrough." My heart had started pounding. What kind of inconsistencies? The kind where patent applications reference laboratory work conducted during times when Dr. Pierce was documented at conferences and board meetings in different cities. She'd pulled out a folder. The kind where preliminary results described in his presentations match almost word for word with research notes filed 6 months earlier by someone else. By you, specifically. I'd stared at her, not quite believing what I was hearing. "How did you—" "I do thorough research before investing millions of dollars," Nora had interrupted. "And I've seen this pattern before. Charismatic directors taking credit for their researchers' work. It's common enough that I've learned to look for the signs." She'd leaned forward. "What I want to know is, do you have proof?" I'd hesitated only a moment before answering. "Yes, comprehensive proof. Timestamps, file metadata, security footage, email trails, everything." Nora had smiled, not a friendly smile, but the smile of someone who just confirmed a suspicion. "Good, because Colin Pierce isn't just stealing from you. He's stealing from the company and, by extension, from potential investors like me. If his claimed breakthrough is built on someone else's work, that's fraud. And I don't invest in fraud." She'd explained that her investment firm had been preparing to pour $15 million into Helix Biogenetics, based largely on the promise of Colin's gene therapy protocol. But before signing contracts, they'd wanted to verify the scientific validity and ensure the company actually owned the intellectual property they were claiming. If Pierce is claiming work he didn't do, the company's patent applications could be invalidated, Nora had explained. Everything built on his false claims could collapse. That's a legal and financial nightmare I need to avoid. I'd felt the first real hope I'd experienced in months. "So what do you want from me?" "I want you to go through with your normal work duties," she'd said. "Act like nothing has changed. Let Pierce continue down this path. But I need you to document everything, and I mean everything, that happens between now and the press conference." The press conference. Pierce is planning a major public announcement in 2 weeks. Media, investors, the whole show. He's positioning this as his crowning achievement. Nora had leaned back. "Let him have his moment. Let him stand in front of cameras and claim your work publicly, on record, where it can't be walked back or explained away. And then we'll show everyone what actually happened." The plan had been audacious and terrifying in equal measure, but it had also been perfect. The week before the press conference had been the longest of my life. Colin had called me into his office one afternoon, and I'd walked in with my heart pounding, wondering if somehow he discovered what I was planning. He gestured for me to sit, his expression serious. "Morgan, I wanted to talk to you about your role in the upcoming announcement." "My role?" I'd kept my voice neutral. "You'll be introducing me at the press conference," he'd said casually, like he was assigning me to make coffee. "I want you to give a brief welcome, talk about the collaborative environment at Helix Biogenetics, and then introduce me as the lead innovator. Make it personal, talk about what an honor it's been to work under my leadership." The audacity had nearly choked me. He didn't just want to steal my discovery. He wanted me to help him do it, to stand on stage and validate his theft in front of everyone. "Of course," I'd said, forcing a smile. "I'd be happy to." Colin had looked relieved. "Good. I know things have been tense lately. I worry sometimes that you feel overlooked. But this is how science works. It's collaborative, and not everyone can be in the spotlight. You're a valued member of the team, Morgan. I hope you know that." I'd nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Colin had continued. "I've written a draft introduction for you. Just some thoughts. Feel free to make it your own, but hit these key points about teamwork and my leadership vision." He'd slid a paper across his desk. I'd taken it, scanned the words he'd written for me to say, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Every sentence had been designed to diminish me while elevating him. That evening, I'd met with Nora again at the same coffee shop. I'd shown her Colin's drafted introduction, and she'd photographed it with her phone. "This is perfect," she'd said. "He's making it too easy. The more publicly he claims this work, the harder it'll be for him to backtrack when the truth comes out." "What exactly happens at the press conference?" I'd asked. "How does this work?" Nora had explained the plan carefully. The company had arranged for a major media event: local news stations, scientific journalists, industry magazines, and potential investors. Colin would present the gene therapy breakthrough, explaining the science and its potential applications. The whole thing would be live-streamed on the company's website and social media. "Here's what we're going to do," Nora had said. "You'll give your introduction exactly as planned. Let Pierce have his moment in the spotlight. Let him present the slides, take the credit, bask in the applause. Let him commit to his story completely. And then I'm going to ask a question from the audience, specifically about the research timeline and methodology. Pierce will answer with his version of events. And that's when you'll step onto the stage with evidence that contradicts everything he just said." My hands had started shaking. "They'll destroy me. The company, my career." "No," Nora had interrupted firmly. "They'll destroy him. You have time-stamped proof. You have security footage. You have metadata from the company's own servers showing exactly when and how the research was conducted. You have emails, file histories, and third-party verification. What does he have? His word, his reputation, and both of those are about to become worthless." The last few days had been a blur of preparation. I'd worked with Nora and a lawyer she'd connected me with to organize my evidence into a presentation that was clear, undeniable, and devastating. We'd created a video file showing side-by-side comparisons of my original research notes and Colin's later presentations. We'd compiled the metadata showing file creation dates and modifications. We'd included clips from security footage showing me working alone in the laboratory during the hours when my breakthrough experiments had occurred. The lawyer had explained that what Colin had done wasn't just unethical, it was legally actionable. By claiming work he hadn't done on patent applications and in official company communications, he'd committed fraud. The company could face serious consequences if they'd known about the deception, and Colin personally could face even worse. "The key," the lawyer had said, "is doing this publicly. If you'd tried to handle this internally through HR or management, they might have buried it to avoid scandal. But once it's public, recorded with media present, they'll have no choice but to address it honestly." I'd practiced my statement over and over in my apartment mirror, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to sound professional rather than emotional. Because that was critical. If I came across as angry or vindictive, people might dismiss me as bitter or jealous. But if I presented facts calmly, let the evidence speak for itself, no one could argue with the truth. The night before the press conference, I'd barely slept. I'd lain awake thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. What if people didn't believe me anyway? What if Colin somehow talked his way out of it? What if the company closed ranks to protect him? But when morning came, and I'd put on my best professional outfit and driven to the company's headquarters, I'd felt something unexpected. Calm. I'd done everything possible to prepare. The evidence was overwhelming. The truth was on my side. All I had to do now was let it unfold. The auditorium had been packed when I'd arrived. 200 seats filled with journalists, investors, company executives, and colleagues. Camera crews had set up in the back. The company's livestream team had been testing audio and lighting. It had been the kind of production usually reserved for major pharmaceutical breakthroughs or corporate acquisitions. Colin had been backstage, looking more confident than I'd ever seen him. He'd been wearing an expensive suit, his hair perfectly styled, practicing his speech in front of a mirror. When he'd seen me, he'd smiled warmly. "Morgan, there you are, nervous." "A little," I'd admitted truthfully. "Don't be. This is a celebration. Just read the introduction I gave you, make it sound natural, and then I'll take over. Easy." He'd adjusted his tie, checking his reflection one more time. "This is going to be huge for the company, and for my career. Sometimes I think about how lucky I am to have ended up with such a groundbreaking project." I'd nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The irony of him calling it lucky when he'd stolen it outright had been too much. Nora had arrived shortly after, taking a seat in the third row where she'd have a clear view of the stage and easy access to a microphone for the Q&A session. She'd given me a subtle nod, and I'd felt my resolve strengthen. This was happening. There was no turning back now. The press conference had begun at 2:00 exactly. The company's CEO had given a brief welcome, talking about Helix Biogenetics' commitment to innovation and groundbreaking research. Then he'd introduced me to introduce Colin, layers of introduction that would have been funny if they hadn't been so tragic. I'd walked onto the stage, the spotlight blindingly bright after standing in the wings. 200 faces had looked up at me expectantly. I'd approached the microphone, my prepared introduction in my slightly trembling hands. "Good afternoon," I'd begun, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "It's an honor to introduce today's presentation on a breakthrough that represents years of dedicated research and countless hours in the laboratory." I'd paused, letting the words settle. "Dr. Colin Pierce has been our department director for 8 months, and in that time, he has overseen several important projects." I deviated slightly from his script, using language that was technically accurate but subtly different from the glowing praise he'd written. "Today's announcement represents work that has been developed through meticulous experimentation, careful documentation, and a deep commitment to scientific integrity." Another pause. "Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Colin Pierce." The applause had been thunderous. Colin had walked onto the stage, shaking my hand with that charismatic smile, and taken his position at the podium. I'd moved to stand off to the side, where I'd have a clear view of everything that happened next. Colin had launched into his presentation with practiced ease. He'd talked about his vision for gene therapy. He'd explained his methodology for isolating specific gene sequences. He described his breakthrough moment when the protocol had finally worked. Every word had been mine, stolen and repackaged in his voice. The slides had continued, one after another, showing my research under his name. The audience had been captivated, leaning forward in their seats, taking notes, murmuring to colleagues about the implications of this discovery. Colin had been in his element, gesturing dramatically, making eye contact with key investors, dropping hints about patent applications and potential pharmaceutical partnerships worth millions. "This protocol represents a fundamental shift in how we approach genetic disorders," he'd said, his voice filled with passion that would have been moving if it hadn't been built on lies. "The applications are nearly limitless, from correcting inherited conditions to potentially preventing genetic diseases before birth." A journalist in the front row had raised her hand. "Dr. Pierce, can you walk us through your research timeline? How long did it take to develop this protocol?" Colin had smiled confidently. "The initial concept came to me about 2 years ago. From there, it was a process of trial and error, testing different approaches, running countless experiments. The breakthrough came approximately 3 months ago, when I finally isolated the correct gene sequence and delivery method. 2 years ago, when I'd still been working under Dr. Vega and Colin hadn't even been at the company. 3 months ago, when he'd stolen my presentation from the shared server. The lies had been so blatant I'd wondered how he'd thought he'd get away with it. But then I'd remembered he'd gotten away with it before. Multiple times, across multiple positions. He'd believed his reputation, and charisma would protect him like they always had. That's when Nora had stood up from her seat in the third row. "Dr. Pierce," Nora had called out, her voice clear and professional. "Nora Delacroix Ventures, I have a question about the research methodology." Colin had turned toward her, still smiling. "Of course." You mentioned the breakthrough occurred 3 months ago. Can you describe the specific laboratory conditions under which that breakthrough was achieved? What equipment did you personally use? What were the exact dates and times of those successful experiments? The questions had been specific, technical, and designed to trap him. Colin had hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Well, the exact dates would be in my lab notes, of course. As for equipment, we use standard genetic sequencing technology, cell culture facilities. Which specific facility? Nora had interrupted. The lab is equipped with several different spaces. Which one did you use for your breakthrough experiments? Colin's smile had started to look strained. I'm not sure I understand the relevance of... The relevance, I'd heard myself say, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent auditorium as I'd stepped forward to the microphone, is that he's never set foot in the laboratory where those experiments were conducted. The audience had erupted in confused murmurs. Colin had turned to me, his face going from confident to shocked to furious in rapid succession. Morgan, what are you? My name is Morgan Hayes, I'd continued, my voice surprisingly steady as I'd looked out at the audience rather than at Colin. I'm a research analyst in Dr. Pierce's department, and everything he just presented, the methodology, the research, the breakthrough was my work, not his, mine. The cameras had swiveled toward me. Journalists had started shouting questions, but I'd kept talking, pulling out my phone and connecting it to the auditorium's projection system. I have evidence, I'd said, my voice cutting through the chaos. Comprehensive, timist, amped, undeniable evidence, and I'd like to show it to everyone here and everyone watching the live stream right now. The screen behind me had flickered as my presentation file had loaded. Colin had stepped toward me, his face pale. This is completely inappropriate. Morgan, if you have concerns, we can discuss them privately. No, I'd interrupted, looking directly at him for the first time. We're done discussing things privately. We're done with you dismissing me, marginalizing me, and stealing my work while I stay quiet to keep the peace. The first slide had appeared on the screen, a side-by-side comparison. On the left, my original presentation file with visible metadata showing creation date, author, and timestamp. On the right, Colin's version with his name and a creation date 2 weeks later. This is my original gene therapy protocol, I'd explained, addressing the audience. Created 18 months ago, saved to the company server under my name. You can see the metadata here, file properties that can't be faked or modified without leaving traces. The next slide had shown email exchanges between me and colleagues, discussing specific aspects of the methodology months before Colin had joined the department. Then came the security footage. The auditorium had gone completely silent as video played showing me alone in the laboratory at 3 a.m, running the experiments, recording results, having the exact breakthrough moment Colin had just claimed as his own. The timestamp was clearly visible on the footage. This is from 3 months ago, I'd said. The night the protocol finally worked. As you can see, I was alone in the laboratory. Dr. Pierce was not present. More footage had followed. Weeks of recordings showing me working independently, while Colin was documented at conferences, board meetings, and company events in different cities entirely. The journalists had started shouting questions, but I'd held up my hand. There's more. The next slides had shown the file modification history from the company's own IT systems, clear evidence that Colin had accessed my files, copied them, and modified them to remove my name and insert his own. Email trails showed him discussing his protocol with patent attorneys and investors, never once mentioning my actual authorship. Finally, I'd played one last piece of evidence, an audio recording from a department meeting 2 months ago where Colin had explicitly taken credit for specific experimental techniques, claiming he'd developed them personally. I'd then shown my lab notebook entries documenting those exact techniques 6 months earlier, complete with my signature, and the date witnessed by Dr. Vega before her retirement. Dr. Pierce didn't develop this protocol, I'd concluded, my voice quiet but carrying clearly through the microphone. He didn't conduct the experiments. He didn't have the breakthrough. What he did was systematically steal my work, erase my contributions, and claim my discovery as his own. And he did it using his position as director to access my files, manipulate company records, and destroy my credibility so no one would believe me if I spoke up. I turned to face Colin directly. You were right about one thing, this is a breakthrough that could change lives, but it's not yours, it never was. The auditorium had erupted. Journalists had surged forward, shouting questions at both of us. Camera flashes had exploded like lightning. The CEO had rushed onto the stage, his face ashen. And Colin had just stood there, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, his confident facade shattered completely. This is a misunderstanding, he'd finally managed, his voice shaking. Morgan assisted with preliminary work, but the overall vision, the synthesis. The metadata doesn't lie, Nora had called from her seat, standing to address the room. File creation dates, security footage timestamps, IT system logs, these aren't subjective. They're objective facts that can be verified by any third party. She'd held up her phone. I'm an investor who was prepared to put $15 million into this company based on Dr. Pierce's claimed breakthrough. Before committing that capital, I did due diligence. And what I found was systematic fraud, not just theft of intellectual property from Ms. Hayes, but falsified patent applications and misrepresentation to investors. That's not just unethical, it's illegal. The CEO had grabbed Colin's arm, pulling him away from the microphone. Dr. Pierce, I think we need to speak privately. Now. But the damage was done. The live stream was still running. Hundreds of people had watched the confrontation unfold in real time. Within minutes, clips would be circulating on social media, shared by everyone who'd ever been stolen from, dismissed, or told to stay quiet while someone else took credit for their work. Security had escorted Colin off the stage, the CEO following with a panicked expression. As they disappeared backstage, I'd heard Colin's voice, no longer smooth and confident but desperate and pleading. This was a team effort. She's exaggerating her role. You know how emotional junior researchers can get. The CEO's response had been sharp enough to cut through Colin's excuses. The board is calling an emergency meeting. Don't say another word until we have lawyers present. Do you understand what you've done? What this means for the company? I'd stood alone at the microphone, suddenly aware that 200 people were staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to uncomfortable recognition. A journalist had stepped forward, her recorder extended. Ms. Hayes, how long has this been going on? The following weeks had been a whirlwind of investigations, meetings, and media attention I'd never wanted. The company had launched an internal audit that confirmed everything I'd presented. Colin's employment had been terminated within 48 hours, and criminal charges for fraud had been filed by both the company and Nora's investment firm. Multiple other researchers had come forward with similar stories, not from our company, but from Colin's previous positions. A pattern had emerged of systematic theft spanning his entire career, always targeting junior researchers who lacked the power or platform to fight back effectively. Until now, the board had issued a public apology, my name had been added to all patent applications, and I'd been offered Colin's former position as department director. More importantly, the gene therapy protocol was moving forward into human trials under my actual leadership. 3 months after the press conference, I'd stood on a different stage, this time at a scientific conference where I'd been invited to speak about both the research itself and the experience of fighting for proper attribution. The auditorium had been packed with researchers, many of them young women who'd approached me afterward with their own stories of stolen credit and marginalized contributions. How did you find the courage? One had asked. I have proof my supervisor is taking credit for my work, but I'm terrified of speaking up. I'd thought about that question carefully before answering. It wasn't courage, exactly. It was deciding that the truth mattered more than keeping the peace, and understanding that sometimes you have to let people commit to their lies completely before you can prove they're lying. I'd paused, remembering that moment behind the curtain, watching Colin bask in stolen glory. The truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits until the microphone is on, the cameras are rolling, and there's nowhere left to hide. And then it speaks clearly enough that everyone has to listen. Another researcher had raised her hand. Do you regret how it happened? The public confrontation? I'd considered that. The press conference had been brutal, exposing not just Colin, but also the company's failures to protect researchers and verify attribution. It had been messy and uncomfortable and had caused ripples throughout the industry. No, I'd said finally, because private conversations can be dismissed, internal complaints can be buried, but the truth, spoken publicly with undeniable evidence that changes things, not just for me but for everyone who comes after. As I'd left that conference, my phone had buzzed with a message from Dr. Vega. "Proud of you. Your protocol just got approved for expanded trials." But more than that, you showed them that silence isn't the same as agreement. Well done. I'd smiled, thinking about how far I'd come from that moment, standing frozen behind the curtain, watching my discovery being stolen. The gene therapy protocol was moving forward. My career was stronger than ever. And somewhere, young researchers were learning that their work mattered, that their voices deserved to be heard, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room is simply waiting for the right moment to speak. The truth had always been there. I just needed the courage to make sure everyone else could see it too. And when that moment came, when the spotlight was brightest and the audience was watching, the truth had been impossible to ignore. Some victories aren't won through confrontation or combat. They're won through patience, preparation, and the unshakable certainty that facts will always outlast fiction. Colin had built his career on charisma and manipulation, believing his reputation would always protect him. But reputation is just a story people tell. And I'd proven, in front of everyone who mattered, that some stories are fiction, while others are documented, time-stamped, undeniable truth. The microphone hadn't just amplified my voice that day. It had amplified reality itself, making it too loud to dismiss or ignore. And that, I'd learned, was the most powerful weapon of all.